What happened that night was not a mood swing. It was not a random burst of restraint. And it was not proof that the system suddenly became wise. A U.S. strike on Iran was reportedly approved. Assets were positioned. Launch preparations were underway. And then, minutes before execution, the order was pulled back after Iran shot down a U.S. surveillance drone in June 2019. Trump later said he stopped it about 10 minutes before launch. Most people hear that and think one word: chaos. I want you to hear a different word: pattern. Because moments like this are rarely just about personality, impulse, or who was in the room. They are the visible output of a repeatable process. A state builds pressure. It escalates to preserve credibility. A trigger arrives. Military options move from paper to countdown. Then, at the threshold, the system finally collides with the real cost and hesitates. That hesitation is not the opposite of escalation. Very often, it is the last stage of escalation. And once you see that, the Iran episode stops looking like an exception and starts looking like a template. Now step back, because the backdrop matters. Global debt has climbed to levels that make the entire system more brittle. In highly indebted systems, governments and institutions have less tolerance for disruption, but more incentive to project control. That combination creates a dangerous political environment. Less room to absorb shocks, more pressure to signal strength. And that changes how crises behave. Every confrontation becomes a signaling contest. Every signal creates another tripwire. Every tripwire increases the chance of a trigger. And once the trigger hits, decision time collapses. At that point, leaders are not choosing from unlimited possibilities. They are choosing from a narrow menu that was built in advance by alliances, prior promises, military planning, domestic politics, and credibility concerns. That is the core idea. The approved, then canceled strike was not a strange one-off. It was the predictable midpoint of a four-stage crisis mechanism that keeps repeating across history. First, a power builds a strategic posture that only works under stable conditions. Alliances expand, sanctions accumulate, military deployments multiply, red lines are declared, security promises stack up. It looks like strength, but it is conditional strength. Second, the system adds pressure. More public warnings, more coercive signaling, more forward positioning, more visible deterrence. At this stage, escalation starts replacing strategy. The state becomes more focused on preserving the image of control than solving the underlying conflict. Third, a trigger event arrives. A drone is downed. A ship is seized. A border is crossed. A missile lands where it should not. Suddenly, the issue is no longer just the event itself. It becomes a credibility test. Decision windows shrink. Military planners surface pre-built options. The machine is now moving. Fourth, the threshold outcome. The strike happens, or it is narrowed, delayed, outsourced, converted into sanctions, cyber operations, covert action, or a temporary pause. But the system does not reset. It returns later with more distrust, more militarization, and less room for error. That is the formula. And if that sounds too neat, then test it. Start with Suez in 1956. Britain and France still carried imperial assumptions after World War II. They had fleets, institutions, and political habits built for a world in which they could impose outcomes on strategic choke points. The Suez Canal was not just a trade route. It was prestige, leverage, and the visible symbol of imperial continuity. But under that image, the foundation was already weakening. Britain's financial position was fragile. Sterling was vulnerable. U.S. support had become essential. The posture looked solid, but only under stable conditions. That was stage one. Then came stage two. Nasser nationalized the canal, and London and Paris treated it as more than a commercial dispute. They treated it as a direct challenge to geopolitical hierarchy. They coordinated covertly with Israel and moved toward military action to restore deterrence and demonstrate control. That is, overextension in its pure form, trying to solve a status crisis through escalatory choreography. Then, stage three hit. Israel moved into Sinai. Britain and France issued ultimatums and launched operations. On paper, it looked decisive. In reality, the deeper system turned against them. The United States opposed the intervention. Financial pressure quickly became strategic pressure. Britain discovered that it had military tools, but not the economic freedom to use them on its own terms. Then, stage four. Instead of restored authority, the result was withdrawal and humiliation. The reversal did not create the weakness. It exposed it. Structurally, Suez followed the same pattern: posture, overextension, trigger, threshold reversal. Now move to 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often remembered as a triumph of leadership under pressure. Leadership mattered, yes, but the reason the world reached the brink was structural. By the time the missiles were discovered in Cuba, the U.S. and Soviet Union had already built a layered confrontation system around the island. Bay of Pigs, deterrent signaling, alliance expectations, ideological rivalry, domestic political pressure. This was not one isolated crisis. It was an accumulated architecture. That was stage one. Stage two came through escalatory signaling and strategic overreach. The Soviet missile deployment was a high-risk attempt to shift the balance. The U.S. had already expanded pressure on Cuba and operated within a broader Cold War system that demanded visible responses to visible challenges. Both sides were now trapped in credibility management. Stage three arrived fast. Reconnaissance confirmed missile sites. Airstrikes and invasion were debated, forces mobilized, naval confrontation tightened. The public saw decision-making. But the real situation was narrower than that. Both sides were constrained by alliance commitments, military timelines, command limitations, and the fear that visible hesitation would invite further escalation elsewhere. The menu of choices had already been reduced by the system itself. Then stage four, a pullback at the edge. The crisis de-escalated through quarantine, backchannels, and reciprocal concessions, including the quiet removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. The rivalry did not end. It changed form. It moved into hotlines, arms control efforts, and proxy conflict. Same machine, near-strike posture, threshold restraint. Continuation through different instruments. Now jump to Syria in 2013, because this is where modern media dynamics make the pattern harder to see. The U.S. entered the Syrian conflict carrying existing burdens from Iraq and Afghanistan, regional commitments, counterterrorism priorities, and a war-weary public. Then came red line language around chemical weapons. The moment a red line is declared publicly, the system starts pre-writing future decisions. That was stage one. Stage two followed as the conflict intensified. Political rhetoric expanded faster than strategic consensus. Intelligence assessments, alliance expectations, domestic politics, and military planning all increased pressure to act. This is modern overextension, the gap between what a government says and what it is truly prepared to sustain. Then, GOTA. Trigger event. Pressure surged. Military strikes were prepared. Public expectations spiked. International audiences framed it as a test of credibility, and the decision space narrowed. Not what solves Syria, but what response preserves deterrence without opening a larger war or triggering domestic backlash. That is stage three, a degraded decision space disguised as deliberation. Then stage four. The expected strikes were delayed and then displaced by a diplomatic arrangement focused on declared Syrian chemical weapons dismantlement. Whether you view that outcome as prudent or insufficient, the structure is unmistakable. Commitments, escalatory pressure, trigger event, threshold reversal, continuation of conflict architecture. Now return to Iran. But this time, do not watch the headline. Watch the system. The setup had been in place for decades. Sanctions, proxy conflict, naval tensions, nuclear negotiations, withdrawals from agreements, regional rivalry, domestic political narratives, alliance expectations. This was not a fresh crisis. It was a loaded structure. Check. Then came the expansion phase. More sanctions, more pressure, stronger signaling, tighter deterrent messaging. Publicly, this looked like leverage. Structurally, it increased tripwires and reduced flexibility. The more instruments you stack into a confrontation, the more likely one of them becomes a trigger point. Verified. Then the trigger. Iran shot down the U.S. drone. At that point, the issue was no longer just hardware. It became precedent, credibility, and deterrence perception. This is the moment when militaries surface pre-built options and leadership is pushed toward visible action. Undeniable. Then stage four arrived exactly where the pattern predicts it can. At the threshold. The strike path reached the edge. The strike was halted. Casualty and proportionality concerns suddenly became decisive. People interpreted that through politics. Impulsiveness to some, restraint to others. But politics explains only part of it. Structurally, the pattern had already completed. The system escalated until it collided with the real cost profile. That is why this episode matters. Not simply because a strike almost happened, but because the system moved toward launch so quickly, so predictably, and with so little strategic slack. And this is where public analysis often fails. When a strike is canceled at the threshold, many people assume danger has passed. Sometimes the opposite is true. Threshold cancellations can increase future risk because every actor learns from them. They map reactions, they study casualty tolerances, they test signaling boundaries. They refine red lines, they identify what triggers action and what triggers restraint. In other words, the system becomes more informed, not necessarily more stable. That is why these moments repeat. Suez showed how financial dependence can break military posture. Cuba showed how decision windows can become too narrow for genuine freedom of action. Syria showed how public signaling can create militarized expectations without a coherent endgame. Iran revealed the same architecture in compressed modern form. Pressure, trigger, launch. Ready options, threshold reversal. And this pattern is becoming more common, not less. Because the environment around it is more brittle, more debt, more media acceleration, more transparency, more performative signaling, less time to think, less strategic slack. That combination produces a world full of almost moments, almost strike, almost war, almost de-escalation, almost stability. But almost is not safety. Almost is system strain. And if you are thinking, yes, but this time is different. We have better intelligence, better modeling, AI forecasting, precision targeting, instant communication. That is exactly what every era tells itself. Every era believes its tools have finally outgrown the old pattern. They haven't. Technology changes speed. Technology changes optics. Technology changes efficiency. It does not remove structural incentives. If the incentives still reward signaling over resolution, if credibility still outranks stability, if leaders still face compressed decision windows under public pressure, then the machine is still running, just faster. So what do you do with this? Stop treating these events as isolated emotional dramas. Start mapping the system. What commitments already exist? Where's the overextension? Which tripwires have multiplied? What trigger would force a credibility response? What threshold cost is most likely to produce a reversal? Ask those questions early. You can often predict the shape of the next crisis before the headline appears. Also, stop taking the word de-escalation at face value. If the sanctions remain, the deployments remain, the rhetoric remains, and the domestic incentives remain, then you may not be watching de-escalation at all. You may be watching a tactical pause inside an active cycle. And most importantly, protect yourself from narrative whiplash. Modern media systems can flip the story in hours. War is imminent, then crisis over. Both can be wrong. The deeper condition is often structural continuation. That is the clarity you need, not fatalism. Clarity. Clarity means understanding that last-minute restraint can be preferable in the immediate moral sense and still be a systemic warning sign. Clarity means seeing that the scariest part of the Iran episode was not only that a strike was nearly launched, it was that the pathway to launch was already built, and the next trigger will not arrive as a history lecture. It will arrive as breaking news, a drone, a ship, a proxy militia strike, a missile, a limited response package. Another threshold moment explained as personality when it is really structure. Do not get trapped at the surface. Learn the machine, track the stages, watch incentives, not speeches. And when you hear approved, then canceled, understand what you are really hearing, a system reaching the edge of its own design. If you want the next layer, how this machine was built, why debt, deterrence, and credibility crises feed each other, and what the next stage looks like before it becomes visible. Subscribe and watch the next video. Because in an age like this, survival does not belong to the loudest prediction. It belongs to the people who recognize the pattern before the threshold is crossed.